Let's take a look at the types of cells we have in our blood. We'll start with our erythrocytes, or red blood cells. This is the most numerous type of cell in the blood. So out of the cells in our blood, 99.9% of them are actually red blood cells. And if you were to take 1 ml of blood, 5 billion red blood cells would be in that ml of blood. And out of all of the cells in our body, about 1/3 of them are actually red blood cells, which is quite a bit. Red blood cells are only found inside of the blood vessels, which is very different from white blood cells, which can actually leave the blood vessels and travel into the tissues in search of any pathogens or invaders that they need to take care of. The major function of our red blood cells is to carry oxygen. The shape of our red blood cells is a biconcave disc, and what that means is that they're flattened in the middle. And the advantage of having that shape is that it increases the surface area, and then they're able to do gas exchange more quickly. So that's a good thing. The erythrocytes also have a very flexible membrane, and that allows them to bend so that they can actually fit through the very narrow capillaries. They also don't have a nucleus or any organelles. So by not having a nucleus, they're not able to make any proteins and repair themselves. So that means that they have a very short lifespan. They only live about 4 months. It's also good that they don't have any mitochondria, because if they had mitochondria, the mitochondria would actually be using oxygen to make ATP, and then that would use up the oxygen that they're carrying to deliver to the tissues. So for them to make ATP, they're just going to use fermentation because they don't have any mitochondria. And in their cytoplasm, they have lots and lots of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is what's going to be transporting the oxygen. They also have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is going to help with transporting the carbon dioxide, because the red blood cells also do transport a little bit of the carbon dioxide. And this enzyme is also going to be helpful in buffering the blood pH as well. So here's just looking at the biconcave shape of the red blood cell. And so you can see how it's kind of flattened or pinched in the middle here. And that'll increase the surface area so they can do gas exchange a lot quicker. And when you look at a blood smear, you can see all of these red blood cells here. And because they have that biconcave shape where they're thinner in the middle, kind of flattened, it gives them this central pallor, so they're paler in the middle. So that's what we mean when we say central pallor. They're just paler in the middle. And then you can also see that as far as size, the white blood cells here, those are going to be larger than the red blood cells, but the red blood cells are much larger than the tiny platelets. So our erythrocytes are actually packed full of hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin molecules consist of protein. They have 4 polypeptide, or what we call globulin chains. And then there's also 4 heme groups. And the heme groups are really important because they contain an iron atom, and the iron is where the oxygen will attach to on the hemoglobin. So if each hemoglobin has 4 heme groups, how many oxygen can one hemoglobin transport? So hopefully you said that it can transport 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, so one hemoglobin can transport 4 oxygen molecules. When oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, we've got our oxygenated hemoglobin, and it's a bright red color. It's kind of a cherry red. So if you draw blood from a systemic artery, it will be bright red. But if you draw blood from a systemic vein carrying the deoxygenated blood, then it will be kind of a dark maroon red, and that indicates that it's deoxygenated. So it does change color whether it's carrying oxygen or not. And then here's a picture just showing you the hemoglobin molecule that's being carried by the red blood cell. And so you can see the polypeptide chains. There's actually 4 of them. And then each of the polypeptide chains has its own heme group, so there would be 4 heme groups. And in the middle of each of these heme groups, there's an iron atom. And these heme groups have a red color to them, and that's what makes the red blood cells red. And this just shows where the oxygen will bind to the iron atom in the middle of that heme group on the hemoglobin. And then the other thing to remember that we'll be talking more about in chapter 17 is that a small amount of carbon dioxide, about 23% of the carbon dioxide, is actually transported by the red blood cells. It actually will bind to the protein part, the amino acids, on the hemoglobin, and it does not bind to the heme group because that's where the oxygen is binding to. So we'll take a look at that again in chapter 17.